Hi, my name is Simon Dawson, and welcome to this new YouTube channel called Switching View, and a whole series of videos called Intermediate Types. In these videos, we're looking at the interrelationship between homosexuality and the Christian Church, and also the relationship between the wider LGBTQIA history and the Church. But what we're doing is looking at these stories from a different point of view. That's why I'm calling it Switching View. In the past, the dominant view has been that of the Church. The Church was the state power, and therefore its view prevailed. A view that said that people like us were abnormal or disordered or shameful in what we did. I want to turn things round and show evidence that in many parts of the world, for many centuries, if not millennia, people like us were actually regarded as perfectly normal and acceptable, and in many cases were valued for what we could offer to the cultures we lived within. And actually, again, if you look at the evidence, it's the Church that should be ashamed of what it did and what it still does, how the Church has catastrophically damaged the lives of LGBTQIA people. It's all to do with how you tell history. It's all to do with how you tell these stories. So what I'll be doing in this first video, Intermediate Types Part 1, is simply looking at how you tell history and using the ideas of Philip Sheldrake and Edward Carpenter to advise us on different ways of telling historical stories. And then in future videos, I'll be using their methods, their techniques to uncover what I think is a truer history of how we LGBTQIA people existed in the world. A good place to start talking about history is in a book called Spirituality and History by Philip Sheldrake. He writes this: who is permitted to have a history and who is not is a vital issue. Recorded history, imposed from above, is controlled history, beyond whose boundaries are silence and darkness. Those who have no memories or story have no life. And this is the issue. For much of the last 2,000 years, in many parts of the world, then the history was imposed from above by the Christian Church. The Christian Church can have been sometimes the state religion, can impose its history through the force of law, and at other times, in earlier cultures, people who were priests may have been the only people in that culture who could read and write, and therefore theirs was the only history that was being told. And those of us who had no memories were the LGBTQIA, who had our stories told for us by those people, and therefore our lives were suppressed or distorted or damaged. But Sheldrake goes on to say this. He talks about the recovery of the underside of history. And for the last few decades, people have been recovering their stories, telling stories from the underside of history. Women's stories, slavery stories, colonialism stories, and LGBTQ+ stories. Stories that challenge the dominant narrative within the Church and wider society. And this is what I'll be doing, telling my stories from the underside of history, recovering what I believe are the fuller and truer pictures of what LGBTQIA people did in the world. So when it comes to exploring my own ideas about the underside of homosexual history, I'll be starting off with this book, Intermediate Types Among Primitive Folk, A Study in Social Evolution, by a guy called Edward Carpenter. It's an old book written over 100 years ago now, but I think it's important because of Carpenter's research method, his thesis about how you study homosexuality. It's a method that was revolutionary at the time, and it's still important. I think that many modern researchers on homosexuality have still not caught up with Carpenter's thesis. But before we move on, just a few things about that title. Firstly, Among Primitive Folk is unfortunate. It simply reflects the attitudes at the time, the colonial attitudes in Europe to foreign countries. A better title would have been Intermediate Types Among Indigenous Peoples, or Intermediate Types, a Cross-Cultural Study. And as for intermediate types, this is what Carpenter himself wrote. That between the normal man and the normal woman, there exists a great number of intermediate types. Types, for instance, in which the body may be perfectly feminine, while the mind and feelings are decidedly masculine, or vice versa. It's a thing which only a few years ago was very little understood. Basically, the study of homosexuality was new, and people were struggling to find words to describe the things that they were finding out. And intermediate types was a phrase that Carpenter used to describe what we would now call the whole spectrum of LGBTQIA or queer. In fact, it's quite a good phrase to use, intermediate types, because it refuses to define things too closely and just says something, some way these people are in this wide spectrum without defining it too closely, which is probably quite helpful. Carpenter actually wrote a total of 4 books on homosexuality and intermediate type people between 1894 and 1914. And it might be helpful to look at the background to all these books to see how Carpenter developed his ideas, to follow the same basic thesis in all 4 books. Carpenter wasn't writing into a vacuum when he wrote these books. Other people were beginning to study homosexuality, but Carpenter had a major disagreement with the consensus view. The question was this: was homosexuality in some way abnormal, a problem, a disease, a pathology, a crime, or was it an entirely healthy variation of normal human behavior? And this is the question that Carpenter followed for 20 years. In past centuries, homosexuality was seen as an act, something you did, sex with another man or woman of the same gender, and this was seen as a crime, a problem, sodomy, an act against God, or later on, an act against the criminal law of the state. But in the 19th century, then the views were changing, and people began to realize that actually there were a certain sort of people who were intrinsically homosexual, as the word was invented. This was their nature and the way they were. And medical people began to take an interest and to study why these people were the way they were and what could be done to help them. But importantly, homosexuality was still a problem. It was in some way abnormal, unhealthy, a pathology. Probably the most well-known British doctor and researcher on homosexuality is Henry Havelock Ellis. And Ellis saw sexual inversion as a psychic abnormality. Whilst Ellis wanted to be compassionate and not condemnatory about homosexuality, after all, his own wife Edith was a lesbian, Ellis still saw homosexuality as a pathology, an illness in some way, for doctors to research and investigate, and ideally to cure. If they couldn't cure, then they could help the poor benighted sufferer in some way to live with their affliction. And Carpenter had a long correspondence with Ellis about this, trying to persuade him that no, homosexuality wasn't a pathology, it was perfectly normal and healthy, but unfortunately he couldn't get through. In Germany, the main researcher on homosexuality, in fact the guy who invented the term homosexuality, was Richard von Krafft-Ebing. And Carpenter saw Ebing as a medical man who sees chiefly sufferers and patients and studies the pathology of the subject. And as Carpenter saw it, Ebing's main case studies were people who came to him because they were suffering. They might be depressed or anxious. And the issue for Ebing and for Carpenter is if you see somebody who's depressed or anxious, is that depression or anxiety due to their homosexuality or due to, in some way, the prejudice and discrimination they face? And this is the problem with doing case studies on homosexuality in Europe, where homosexuality is illegal. How do you separate the effects of the discrimination from the effects of being homosexual or intermediate types? To give another example, there's a gentleman called Merle, who was a police surgeon who wrote his case studies on homosexuality on people brought to him who had been arrested by the police for male prostitution. And you can see the problems there with that sort of research. So the issue for Carpenter wanting to promote the idea that homosexuality was healthy, how do you do case studies of healthy homosexualities? How do you find case studies of healthy intermediate type people in a country which is riven with discrimination and prejudice? It's not easy. In fact, Carpenter was able to find his case studies of healthy homosexuality by looking back in history and outside Europe. Carpenter was widely read, trained as a child at school in Greek and Latin, And so he was able to look especially in ancient Greece, where male-to-male love was celebrated both for its beauty, but also celebrated by philosophers and historians for the way that people in same-sex relationships could find in these relationships the courage and the mutual support to do fantastic things for the society that they were part of. And so it was argued by many Greek philosophers and historians that same-sex, male-to-male love was the basis of their culture. And by using examples like this and others, Carpenter was able to push back against the modern ideas that homosexuality and intermediate type behaviour was in some way wrong or abnormal or degenerate. Carpenter wrote 4 books over about 20 years, and he developed these ideas as he went through those 2 decades. The first book, Homogenic Love, was a private pamphlet just testing the water carefully in a culture and society where homosexuality was still illegal. And then a decade later, he felt more confident and able to publish The Intermediate Sex, a more developed book leading on from Homogenic Love. This book was very popular and had an influence right across the world. And the Carpenter archive in Sheffield is full of letters from grateful readers who had found Carpenter's book and realised that they weren't alone in the world. They weren't degenerate or freaks, but there were people back in history who are like them, who had been of value to society. And then in Iolaus was the same-sex lover of Hercules, the Greek hero. And this book is an anthology of friendship. Carpenter included many examples of letters, poems, and other texts of same-sex love, both between men and between women, again to show that people who were of this intermediate type were widespread across cultures, widespread across history, many of them quite famous. And so modern readers could realize that they weren't alone in the world, that there were people like them. And then in Intermediate Types Among Primitive Folk, Carpenter develops his thesis to its fullest extent. Firstly, it's important to study LGBTQ issues or intermediate type people in the absence of anti-LGBTQ prejudice and persecution. It's like studying animals. If you study animals in a cage rather than in the wild, will the behavior that you see be their natural behavior or the effect of the enclosure and cage? In the same way, if you study homosexual people in a country where it's illegal, will the behavior be natural behavior or the effect of the prejudice? And how do you find homosexual people in the wild? Then going on from there, anti-LGBTQ prejudice and persecution exists within Christian influenced cultures. And that's just a simple factual statement, which I think nobody would argue against. It's important to say that it's not only in Christian cultures that this discrimination exists. There are in history other countries, especially the more patriarchal ones, where there is some prejudice against homosexual people, but it is not extreme. And in those cultures, if you look carefully at the evidence available to us, intermediate type people were able to exist in many of the subcultures, especially those linked to religion and warfare. But it's in these Christian influenced countries where the prejudice is taken to a much more extreme level. Going on from that, if you want to study LGBTQ issues, you need to do it outside cultures influenced by Christianity to get a fair view of what LGBTQ behavior is like. It's a fairly obvious statement when you think about it, but actually not many people have caught on even a century after Carpenter wrote this book. And it's not easy to find cultures not influenced by Christianity after the colonial history of the last 500 years, because these European colonial countries exported their Christianity and their influence with everything else they exported. And so what you have to do is make the effort to look up pre-colonial indigenous cultures, look at societies and cultures before European colonization got there, or you look back at classical civilizations like Carpenter did with Greece before the advent of Christianity. And what Carpenter found is that if you did that, you get a very different view of what intermediate type people might be and how they were treated. And in many of these cultures across the world and across thousands of years, intermediate type people were in fact accepted as perfectly normal and healthy. And going beyond that, in many cultures, they were valued for what they could bring to society. In Carpenter's own language, investigating thus in this case, we are surprised to find how often, according to the views of these early peoples themselves, inversion in some form was regarded as a necessary part of social life, and Uranian man accorded a certain amount of honour. Inversion and Uranian being two early terms for homosexuality that never caught on. And going beyond this, people being accepted and valued, Carpenter found that there were two areas of life in particular where again and again across cultures and across thousands of years, you would find reports of these people being valued and accepted. Firstly, in the service of religion, and secondly, in the service of warfare. And for shorthand in my research, I've labelled these queer ministry and warrior love. I know that those ideas of warrior love and queer ministry, intermediate type people in the service of religion and warfare, will be hard to accept for many people. Nowadays, the institutions of the church and the armed forces are quite well known for their anti-gay views. But Carpenter was correct. And if you look at the evidence right across the world, there are many reports of such people. Having done the theory in part 1 of this intermediate type introductory video, then in part 2, I'll give you a few examples of both types, queer ministry and warrior love, from across the world and across history. And then in part 3, I'll be asking what went wrong. And it will be looking especially at colonialism, how over about 500 years, the colonial project exported Christian-inspired anti-intermediate type culture and teaching and law, which suppressed and attacked intermediate type people. Suppressed and attacked to the extent that almost nowadays, the memories that such people ever existed has almost been lost. In these introductory videos, all I can do is give a few examples of that sort of thing. But then in subsequent videos, we'll be going into everything in a lot more detail. So we've come to the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting and useful. If you go to the switchingreview.com website, you'll find some web pages created to support my YouTube channel. On the website, you'll find a schedule of every video I have uploaded or plan to upload, with details of what's within each video. Also, there's what I call text and resources documents. I give a lot of detail in these videos, and in these text and resources documents, I list all the evidence to support what I've said, and also quite a lot of information and advice for further reading if you want to follow things up. Mostly where I can, I've listed easily available documents, books, newspaper articles, websites, to make it easy for you to find stuff, rather than articles locked away in university libraries. For the YouTube channel, as always, if you click on the subscribe button and the little bell icon, each time I upload a video, you'll get sent an email letting you know that it's there. And finally, I'm going to ask you a favour. I put a lot of work into making these videos, and I want them to be seen by the largest number of people. So if you have any friends or contacts you think might appreciate these videos, please do tell your friends. Please do spread the word. And that's all for now. Thank you.